Good evening. My name is Ross Emmett, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University, and a professor of political economy in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, of which the center is part. Welcome to another lecture in the series called Perspectives on Economic Liberty, which is hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. The Perspectives series emerges from the center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to pursue that mission is to invite a variety of guests who interrogate our center's topic, evaluating its role for human betterment, for good or ill, revisiting the history of the debate over economic liberty, and also considering its relation to other values. Today is the 101st anniversary of the conclusion of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, often known as the October Revolution because today's date usually lies within the month of October by the old Slavic Julian calendar. The Bolshevik Revolution propelled to the foreground of 20th century thought a man who died 34 years earlier in relative obscurity. Karl Marx lived in the 19th century, but dominated 20th century intellectual life. Perhaps it is appropriate then that we begin our investigation of the perspectives of great thinkers on economic liberty, which will often focus on thinkers who extol the importance of the vast economic growth and economic prosperity that has come over the last 200 years. With a consideration of Marx's criticism of economic liberty and its effect on our social and political economy today. To guide us is our guest today, Dr. Jeff Reiman. Jeff is the William Fraser McDowell Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Social Policy at American University. He's the author of the well-known book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, and among others, on the more academic and philosophical side, his books, A Defense of Political Philosophy, Justice and Modern Moral Philosophy, Critical Moral Liberalism, and As Free and Just as Possible. Some of those in the Skettle community, the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Liberty, will be interested to learn that Professor Reiman spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in India at one point during his career. Our agenda this afternoon will be familiar to some and easily appropriated by all. Professor Reiman will speak and will then join me in the chairs here at my side, where I will ask him a couple of questions to start discussion. Then we will invite questions from the floor for about 15 minutes or so, depending upon how the time goes, maybe more, depending upon the time. And following the conclusion of the Q&A, there's a reception, as some of you have already gotten to the food. Good, I'm glad. There's a reception here in the hall providing opportunity for people to interact with Professor Reiman more. Please remember that many people will probably want to ask him questions. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Reiman to Arizona State University.
Brought my weapons. I'm very happy to be here. I thank Ross Emmett for inviting me. I think it's admirable of him and the Center for Economic Liberty to invite someone to speak who's going to tell you that it's just a form of slavery. We'll get to that. Okay. I'm sort of wired here. I don't know if I'm supposed to be on that, or does everybody hear me okay? Okay, if you can't hear me, start, banging your feet or something like that. Let me just start with a couple of general observations. One is this: Marx and Engels' writings fill 50 large volumes, okay? And I don't think that that 1% of that, in fact, I'm quite sure it's quite a bit less than 1%, talk about socialism and communism. Okay? This is a very important fact. Marx is a theorist of capitalism. He's not a theorist of socialism. He's not a theorist of communism, okay? And nor could he be. Could he have been? There were no such things in his time. There had been no large-scale socialist state, and there had been these little communities, for example, that settled the West in America, some of which were socialist-ish. And of course, there had been no such thing as communism. Marx reached those things by just crossing out the part of capitalism he didn't like, which was private ownership of the means of production. That's to say, factories, machines, raw material, land, and so on. Okay, so you cross out private, so you have to have social. Okay? And that can be done either through the state, which is then called socialism, or directly, which is called communism. Okay? But there's no theory of that, right? There's a theory of capitalism, and there's a theory leading up to it. That's what Marx's writings are about. And this also means something else. It means that Marx's theory can be disconnected from his commitment to or hope for socialism or communism. Whereas you can read Marx and take seriously, maybe even be convinced by what he says about capitalism, and then think, well, heck, yeah, those are problems we have to deal with, but socialism's even worse. Okay? And here's one of the really ironic things. There are pretty good Marxist reasons for worrying about socialism. Right? I mean, after all, Marx thought that ownership of the means of production is the strongest, most powerful form of social control, social power that there is. Well, then you go and put it in the hands of the state? I mean, the state's dangerous enough as it is. In capitalism, they're dangerous enough. They got all the guns already. You want to give them control of the economic? Well, so I mean, this is all to say, I want you to think of this as an analysis of capitalism. What we then do with that, okay? How we then organize our society, whether you think, well, let's just throw it out and have socialism, or let's tinker with the capitalism, try to get rid of the worst parts of it and so on. All of that remains open, okay? Okay. My paper is, as of this morning, Marx on Economic Liberty and Slavery. I had considered calling it Economic Liberty as Slavery, but I thought I'd come in on softer feet. You know, it's going to add up to that. I think it's only fair to tell you, but, you know, I don't want to put anybody off. You know, I mean, really, I mean, think about this also. We've all really been told a lot of bullshit about Marx, okay? So, you know, try to clear that away. Try not to think so much about it. Let's sort of start over. He has a theory. It's a very interesting theory. It's a very powerful theory. When you start to see it, what happens is as if, like, when things turn into the negative, you know, the holes look like the thick parts, and the solid stuff looks like the holes. Everything looks differently, right? And that's a very valuable experience, a very illuminating experience. Okay, so open yourself for that. Okay. Marx says of capitalism that it is a system of forced labor, no matter how much it may seem to result from free contractual agreement. Okay? Marx is writing at the same time as John Stuart Mill. They are both liberals. They are both people who are interested in freedom. Marx is critical of capitalism because he thinks he has discovered another form of coercion, right? Everybody knows about the, you know, guns and knives and all that stuff. Marx thought he saw another one, another form of coercion in capitalism. Okay? So in a sense, he's got the similar interest in liberty. He differs from Mill in what he thinks the threat to liberty is, or the main threat. In this statement that capitalism is a system of forced labor, no matter how much it may seem to result from free contractual agreement, there's the truth that Marx wants to assert about capitalism, but there's something else, okay? There's a hint about ideology, right? Ideology for Marx is a set of beliefs that in some sense hides the injustice of society. So it must be, if not false, at least misleading. Okay, I'm going to talk about this. Capitalism, he thought, is a kind of slavery. Not the chattel slavery of the antebellum South, because workers can't be bought and sold, right? But slaves nonetheless, because they are forced to work without pay. That's what Marx will argue. At the same time, we tend not to see this slavery because the workers have economic liberty. We shall see that Marx thinks that capital slavery works through and hides behind economic liberty. To understand how this works, I will first discuss the coercion that Marx found in capitalism, and then turn to Marx's understanding of ideology, the belief system that hides capitalist coercion. And now, that you all know that I own a sport coat, I'm going to take it off. And something. Okay, part one of my talk is called Capitalist Coercion and Economic Liberty. Marx held a labor theory of value. He was not alone in thinking that labor was the source of economic value. Philosopher John Locke had a labor theory of value, and economist David Ricardo, who was an English economist, also a contemporary of Marx in the 19th century, also had a labor theory of value. And there's something profoundly plausible about it. I mean, if you are trying to evaluate an economy from the standpoint of what the economy does to the natural system we find ourselves in, then one thing you could do is sort of try to imagine the society without any kind of rules and ask yourself, what does a person give in labor, in producing, in working? Right? What does he give? Well, he doesn't give his talents, because talents aren't given. Talents become more when you use them rather than less. Okay? And he doesn't give raw materials, because raw materials can only be given if they're owned. So that already presupposes the system of property that you're trying to evaluate, or one that's like that. Right? Well, what's left is labor. And labor is, in a sense, a kind of natural gift. That's to say, gift of the worker. It can be given. Labor, after all, is life itself. It's time of life given to some employer or to some user of a commodity. Okay? If I labor for an hour, that's an hour of my life, an hour of my energy, an hour of the time I have on earth. Okay? So that is really a natural candidate for the ultimate, basic, natural source of value, and that's how Marx proceeds. Based on the labor theory of value, Marx held that the value of a commodity is equivalent to the amount of labor time necessary to produce it. Okay? And I was talking about the whole system, thinking of labor as exercised at a kind of average level of intensity, because some people work a little harder, some people work a little not so hard. Okay? The average amount, and then measure that by the time. That's the labor that goes into producing commodities in the society. Under capitalism, the worker's ability to labor, what Marx calls labor power, is sold to the capitalist in return for a wage. But labor power is also a commodity. Okay? Its value is also equivalent to the labor time necessary to produce it. Okay? So that to produce labor power, that means to maintain a functioning worker. Okay, so what goes into the food and clothing and shelter and so on, the things that the worker buys with his wage, that's the price of the commodity of labor power. That's what it costs to produce labor power. Okay? The worker receives this, and also, this is also an interesting fact, not widely known. Marx thinks that there's a component of the value of labor power that's culturally determined. He thinks in some societies you have a kind of history that leads to treating the workers better than in others. And so there's what he calls a moral element to the value as well. Okay? But basically, the worker sells labor power, he gets paid the value of his labor power, which is the labor time necessary to produce the stuff he buys with his wage. The capitalist obtains the money he pays as a wage by selling what the worker produces during the time for which he is employed. If the worker produced an amount of value that was equivalent to the value of his wage, then of course the capitalist would have no reason to hire him, right? He'd be getting value from the worker, okay? Selling it, getting money, giving back the equivalent to the worker. Well, that's a non-starter, right? So if labor is the value, back up a second, okay? Labor power, however, has the unique capacity to produce more value than its value, okay? That's to say, remember, the worker sells labor power. He doesn't quite sell labor. He sells his ability to labor, which itself is a commodity. Okay? And that power is a power to produce more value than the value of the commodity labor power. Okay? Now, that's a complicated way of saying something like this, that if you look at all the stuff that gets produced in the society, it's all produced by workers. That's true by definition. Workers of some sort, whatever kind of workers they are. They're laboring in some way to produce that. But it doesn't all go back to the workers. Okay? Some bosses get it. Some people who just own shares of stock, little pieces of paper get some of it. Actually, some very, very rich people just own the little coupons. Okay? So it's got to be that the worker is giving more labor power than he receives back as the equivalent of his wage, okay? The worker can work longer than the labor time equivalent to the value of the wage he receives. The amount of labor time that the worker works to produce value equivalent to his wage, Marx calls necessary labor. The additional labor time that the worker works beyond this, Marx calls surplus labor. And the value that surplus labor produces, Marx calls surplus value. Surplus value belongs to the capitalist and is the substance of his profit. Okay? If I was teaching this, I'd have a blackboard and I would sort of show you, I'd make an 8-hour day, and I'd say, well, suppose the worker gets $10 an hour, he gets $80, so in 4 hours, oh, microphone. Thank you. Okay. So in 4 hours, he produces $40 worth. Okay? Well, anyway, I'm not doing the math right. So I would show you that what's basically happening is you can say these many hours the worker produces the equivalent of his wage, and after that he's producing more. That's where the place where the worker can produce more value than the value of his labor power. That's what that cashes out to be. Okay? Because of this, the labor theory of value enables us to see something that's hidden by money wages. If I give you a money wage, no matter how small it is, it pays for all the work you did for me. I might give you $1 for 10 hours labor, then you get 10 cents an hour, right? It's the beauty of mathematics. You just divide the number into the amount of the wage, and all the hours are paid for. But if you think that labor is about producing labor is the source of value, and labor power is a commodity that has its own value, okay, then you see something else. You see that some of the value produced by the worker is not compensated. Okay? And again, this comes from the simple fact that if the capitalist could only get from the worker the equivalent of the wage that he gives him, he wouldn't hire him in the first place. So he only hires him if he can get some of his labor power for free. Okay? So it's a kind of necessary, it's a logical thing. Once you accept the labor theory of value, then you have to accept that the capitalist is getting some of that labor power for free, no matter what the money says, right? Because, like I say, the money can always be divided by any number you want to divide it by. Okay. So Marx calls this feature of money, by the way, the money illusion. Okay? And so what you're seeing here is that the labor theory of value now enables us to see through the money illusion. Okay. Okay. As I said to you, the workers produce everything but receive back for their troubles only a part of it. And so you get this excess that I've talked about. Marx writes, the secret of profit resolves itself into having the disposal of a definite quantity of other people's unpaid labor. Right? That's the secret of capitalism. That's the secret of the profit that capitalists earn. And by the way, everybody was wondering about this in the 19th century, not just Marx, because it is a kind of an interesting thing. If you assume that people are, that money has a value and the workers are being paid something for what they do, where does this new stuff come from? Right? How can there be a profit? Why should the worker, if the worker's labor is worth this, the capitalist pays for it and somehow ends up with more? How does that happen? Everybody was wondering where this profit comes from. And Marx tried to answer that. Okay. But for Marx, capitalism is not only a system in which unpaid labor is extracted from workers, it is a system in which workers are forced to provide this labor. Workers are not merely shortchanged, they are enslaved. Okay? Capitalism, says Marx, is a coercive relation. The coercion, however, is not the direct sort that characterized classical or what's sometimes called chattel slavery. The slavery we had here, for example, in the early part of the 19th century and, of course, before that. Lacking, it is an indirect force built into the fact that capitalists own the means of production and workers do not. Okay? That feature of society is what forces the workers to work for the capitalists. Okay? Lacking ownership of means of production, workers lack their own access to the means of acquiring a living, which is to say, to the means of living, period. What are the means of acquiring a living? They are the means of putting food on your table and clothes on your back and a shelter over your head and so on. Okay? Lacking ownership of means of production, workers lack their own access to the means of living at all. By this very fact, workers are compelled to sell their labor to those who own means of production. Okay? I mean, imagine, before capitalism, you had artisans who generally owned their own tools. Maybe it was one donkey or, a saw or something like that, but they owned it. Okay? So they always had access to the means of production. They could always do something that somebody else would pay for. It may not have been much. But if you don't have the means of production, well, then you can't work. Then you can't translate your labor into value, into money, into food, into clothing, into shelter. Okay? And so you are forced. You have no choice. By this very fact, workers are compelled to sell their labor to those who do own means of production, that is capitalists, since the alternative is either painful or fatal, poverty or starvation. This compulsion is not in conflict with economic liberty, meaning by economic liberty I mean the freedom to dispose of what one owns, money, goods, labor, whatever. Okay, that's economic liberty. Indeed, compulsion works through economic liberty. Since labor agreements are freely entered into, each side must offer the other a reason for agreeing. If, as I said earlier, the workers offered capitalists only as much labor as went into the wage goods they will get back in return from the capitalists would have no reason to purchase their labor. It follows that no matter how free the wage contract is, as long as it occurs in a context in which only some own the means of production, those who do not own means of production will be compelled to give up some of their labor to those who do without compensation. Thus, Marx describes the wage worker as a man who is compelled to sell himself of his own free will. In short, Marx does not deny that capitalism is characterized by economic liberty. Rather, Marx contends that capitalism forces the worker to work by means of economic liberty. The division of the society into the capitalist and worker classes, defined by ownership and non-ownership of means of production respectively, is what coerces the worker to work without compensation. It coerces in the same way that a social structure that allotted to one group ownership of all the available oxygen would coerce the other group to work for them. Beyond what was necessary to defend this group against challenges to their ownership of oxygen, no additional force would be necessary for this coercion. It would operate quite effectively by means of bargains freely struck, in which the non-oxygen owners had to offer something to the owners to get the chance to breathe. They too would be compelled to sell themselves of their own free will. As with the oxygen-owning society, so too with capitalism. Overt force is used or threatened only to defend owners against challenges to their ownership. In fact, it's used to defend workers as well, right? The state uses force to protect private property, whoever happens to own it and whatever it is. You know, it happens to be the muscles in your back, that's one thing. If it happens to be a big factory or something, the state will protect it. Okay? This differs crucially from the way in which overt force is exercised in social relations like classical or chattel slavery. In such slavery, the use of overt force is part of the normal exercise of the master's power. In capitalism, it's not part of the capitalist power. Okay? The capitalist can't threaten to beat a recalcitrant worker. Okay? He can fire him. That's to say, they have a voluntary agreement. It's voluntary on both sides. Either side can withdraw, so he can fire him. He can't beat him up the way the master can lash the slave. The force exists behind the scenes. The force exists in setting up this system where you have owners of means of production and people who don't own means of production. Once you have that, once that's protected by the state, no more visible force is necessary. Okay? No violence is necessary. No threats. Okay? And precisely because this, the state then does that for both sides. The state protects the workers' property. The state will come in if your boss hits you or says, I'll kill you if you don't come to work on Sunday or something like that. The state will come in and protect you. And of course, if you and the other workers say, well, in return, we're going to take the factory and kick you out, well, the state will come in and protect his property. Okay? And this, of course, makes the state seem neutral, right? It protects everybody's right to property, right? Not just one side. Right? This, of course, brings us to the question of ideology, right? Though capitalist states normally favor the interests of capitalists over those of workers, for example, the recent tax bill you may have read about that's supposed to be helping the middle class, doesn't seem to be helping the middle class. They didn't seem to notice that they were benefiting from it. Okay? Right? So, we're not surprised that the state in capitalism tends to favor the capitalists, right? That's, of course, true. But because of the state's use of force to protect both capitalists and workers in their economic liberty, okay, the state can appear neutral. And this brings us to the issue of ideology, the belief system that hides the coerciveness of capitalism. In the study of social revolutions, Marx writes, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out, right? So there's the real material base, and then there's the beliefs that we get, that we somehow use to understand what we're doing and when we struggle within it. As the word etymology suggests, as the etymology suggests, the word ideology started off meaning a science of ideas, literally an ideology. In fact, just as a little side note, this was first used by a guy with a French Enlightenment, a lesser French Enlightenment thinker named Antoine de Stute de Tracy. De Stute de Tracy was his whole last name. Isn't that a cool last name? I mean, 4 different words in your last name? Okay. And so he wanted to study the sources. You know, in the Enlightenment, they were, you know, reason is going gangbusters, but wait a second, everybody is making mistakes. So they, you know, de Stute de Tracy proposed we need a science of the source of ideas, right? So you would have a science of this, and actually, de Stute de Tracy was a favorite of Jefferson's. And Jefferson proposed that there be a course on ideology in the University of Virginia when he founded it. Okay, now, once there's Marx, ideology comes no longer to mean the science of ideas. It means the content of the false or misleading beliefs caused by capitalism. Let's leave the question of cause out, but I mean, that's obviously the punchline here, okay? It means you could have ideology in a serf society as well, okay? But it's doing the same thing. It's somehow protecting the rich and the economic relations that exist there, and there it does it with religious things that, you know, give pride of place to the parent, to the father. Then the father is the king, and right. So you use this kind of thing to justify or another kind of unequal relation of property. So that's ideology as well. Okay, but we're interested here in the ideology of Marxism. Okay. Okay, so these ideas are in some sense misleading. They support capitalism by hiding its injustice and so on. Now, Marx is a materialist, okay? Not just, although this too, in the classical sense that, say, Democritus or Hobbes were materialists. That's to say they were metaphysical materialists or ontological materialists, people who believe that anything that exists is material, right? Democritus. Marx wrote his doctoral dissertation on Democritus, okay? In case you're interested in some reading on the side here. I've never read it. I mean, reading Kapital is enough, believe me. But that's an interesting fact. He was into materialism somehow. Okay, but he was not, he was a metaphysical materialist, don't get me wrong. He did believe that the only thing that exists was matter, okay? But the crucial way in which he was a materialist was not that. It was a more social sense. What he believed was that the process of material production, okay, the process of material production, the way in which society was organized for its material reproduction, that's where the ideas come. That's what shapes the society. That's what shapes the beliefs in people's heads. Here he is directly rejecting the idea that history happens as a kind of march of beautiful ideas, a kind of Hegelian idea that there's a kind of progress that lives right in the ideas themselves. Okay? Marx sees the progress in the ideas, but he doesn't think they come from the ideas themselves. He thinks they come from the material base, the material relations, and since there's progress on the material level, okay, say between serfdom and between slavery and serfdom, between serfdom and capitalism, okay, then there's progress in the ideas. But it's not the ideas that cause it. The ideas are symptoms. They're products of that causal process. Okay. Thus, for a Marxian theory of ideology, what you have to show is that ideology is a product of the mode of production, of the capitalist organization of production. And so Marx writes, "We do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men on the basis of their real life process, their way of producing material goods. We demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes." Right? The ideology is a kind of reflex to the material system and echoes of this life process. A materialist explanation of ideology, then, does not view ideology as, say, the result of false propaganda. It's not because the state or the capitalists are telling lies. Okay? They believe the same thing that the workers believe. Okay? Everybody believes. I asked a worker one time, why do you think you're free? You take orders from your boss all your waking life. He says, well, I signed on for that job freely, right? I have economic liberty. Okay? So I'm free. Everybody believes that in capitalism. Well, there's 5 or 6 of us who don't. But okay. It's important to see that this way of thinking about ideology sees it's not a subjective error. It's not just a mistake that an individual makes. Okay? It's more of what I want to call an objective illusion. And that's the result of roughly accurate perception of the organization of material production. Okay? So what you have to see to have a Marxian theory of ideology is how the material process of production, okay, seen as it is, leads to false beliefs about capitalism. Okay? We can fix this idea of an objective illusion by considering a very common example of one, namely the illusion that the sun goes around the earth. Okay? Any illusion, any erroneous belief that an individual holds can be stated as a subjective error. You're making a mistake if you think the sun goes around the earth. We now know it doesn't. Okay? A person who believes that the sun rises above a stationary horizon in the morning makes a mistake. But this mistake differs crucially from, say, the mistake of believing that the light is green when it's red that a colorblind person might make, or the mistake of believing that a number is 4 when it's 2 that a person balancing his checkbook might make. Those mistakes arise in individuals primarily as a result of defective perception. They are subjective illusions. In such cases, correcting the defective perception should undo the mistake. The mistaken belief that the sun goes around the earth is an objective illusion. It arises as a result of normal sound perception. That's how it looks. Look harder. It still looks that way. Right? You can't correct it by looking more carefully. Okay? You can't go back and say, oh, that really was a 2. I thought it was a 4. Okay? You look harder, you see the same thing. Neither healthier vision nor looking more carefully will enable an individual to correct this mistake and see that what occurs at dawn is not the sun rising above the horizon, but the horizon tipping down before the sun. The illusion that capitalism is uncoercive is a mistake of the same type as the illusion that the sun goes around the earth. What corresponds to capitalism, in capitalism, to the movement of the sun seen from the earth is economic liberty. Okay? The voluntary exchange of wages and labor power between capitalists and workers. Okay? Marx recognizes that the sphere of exchange, characterized by economic liberty, is the objective basis of ideology when he writes that in this sphere of exchange, quote, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on is in fact a very Garden of Eden of the innate rights of man. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their free will. The normal perception of economic liberty in exchange gives rise to the ideological illusion that capitalism is uncoercive. This is not because economic liberty in exchange is an illusion. On the contrary. For Marx, capitalism only works because the moment of exchange through which the circuit of capital constantly passes is truly free. Marx writes, quote, for the conversion of his money into capital, the owner of money must meet in the market with the free laborer, free in the sense that as a free man, he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity. That's the definition of economic liberty, right? It's because the worker has economic liberty that he can be forced to work. And capitalism needs that liberty. If it didn't, then there would be no regular way in which the value of commodities reflected the value of the labor that went into them, right? The slave master doesn't have to give the slave back anything like the equivalent of the labor he gives him because he rules by his physical mastery. It's only because the worker is free that there's a market that allows the worker to insist at least on covering the expenses needed to keep him alive. So this economic liberty is necessary, and it is a real freedom. Rather than denying the reality of economic liberty in capitalism, Marx holds that such liberty is a necessary part of capitalism. Capitalism coerces the workers by means of economic liberty, not in violation of it. In exchange, the power that capitalists have over workers due to ownership of the means of production recedes from view. Thus, the unequal power of capitalist and worker appears as their equal power to withhold from exchange what they happen to own. And their social inequality appears as the difference between the things that they happen to own. Okay? So instead of thinking, gee, this capitalist is forcing me to work, I think, well, gee, you know, he owns a factory, I don't. What do you expect? Okay? I got this, he's got that. Okay? To use the famous words of Marx's analysis of the fetishism of commodities, a social relation between men assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of relation between things. However unequal or even unfree they really are, the parties to the labor contract appear as free and equal persons who just happen to own different things. In capitalism, this equality is a legal fact. Buyer and seller of labor power have the equal legal right to economic liberty. Neither can use violence to get what he wants from the other. This equal legal right abstracts from the differences in what people own, and thus from differences in their power to withhold their property from the market, as well as differences in how great their need is for what they want to get on the market. Right? The legal right gives you a right to own X, whatever you happen to own. Right? Fill it in. Right? It's a blank. It's abstract. It's purely formal. We each have the, if I own a big factory and you own nothing but the muscles in your back, the law views us as equals. We each have the same legal right to sell or refuse to sell what we happen to own. But for Marx, the differences in power and need between those who own means of production and those who do not is the fundamental truth of our relationship, let's say between worker and capitalist. Thus, the law, in treating us as equals, I mean us, worker and capitalist, functions ideologically. It hides our real relationship. To illustrate what the law does here, I want to tell you about something from the early days of TV. In those old days, when the world was black and white, I'm sure you've read about this, okay? There was a wonderfully creative comedian named Ernie Kovacs. In one episode of Kovacs' TV show, the scene is a farmhouse kitchen. There's a table in the center, and there's a pitcher of milk and a couple of glasses on it. When the farmer tries to pour some milk, however, instead of going into the glass, it goes like that and makes a very big mess, and everybody laughs hilariously, so on. People were simpler then. That won't make you guys laugh, right? But in those days, we laughed at things like that. It pours down at a sharp slant and, of course, misses the glass and makes a big mess and so on. Eventually, on Ernie Kovacs' show, the TV camera pulls back and straightens up so that we see that the farmhouse kitchen is a set mounted on an angle, right? It's like a whole room mounted like this, okay? And you also see that the television camera was mounted this way. You see what I'm saying? So that you see it as this. You follow what I'm saying? The set is like this, the camera is like that, on our screens it looks like that. That's what the law does, okay? The law is doing what the camera is doing. It's slanting the slant so it looks horizontal, okay? Imagine that the angle of the farmhouse kitchen represents different people's degrees of power. When the kitchen looks horizontal, people are represented as equal in power, confronting each other on what today we would call a level playing field. That the kitchen is actually slanted means that what looks like a level playing field is not at all level. What looks like equal power turns out to be unequal, right? When we say a level playing field, we mean all the players have basically the same power. They don't have the advantage you'd have from being higher up. Okay, which would give you greater power. Gravity's on your side and so on. So what's happening is that the society is on an angle because there are some people a lot more powerful than others, but it's made to look as if they're on an even level, a level playing field. Moreover, we see that the illusion was due to the TV camera being slanted at the same angle as the kitchen. And this is just how the law functions ideologically in capitalism. By its formality, right? By its emptiness, by its abstracting from the differences in power between those who own means of production and those who don't, the law makes it seem like the buyer and the seller are operating on a level playing field when they are not. Okay? In other words, the law slants our view of reality, making people with vastly different amounts of wealth look like they are all at the same level. Okay? It makes capitalist and worker look equal in power. I sometimes imagine this as if it were height that represented our power. Okay, so the powerful people are tall, the workers are short. Okay, so you got their heads in a line like this, and along comes the law, and it just looks at the heads. Right? It just looks at the right bearers. It just looks at the same right. Each one has the same right. They can dispose of or refuse to dispose of what they happen to own. Okay? What they happen to own doesn't come out in the picture, because we're just looking from here. Note that in what I've just described, there's no falsehood, no deliberate misrepresentation. Capitalists and workers really do possess equal economic liberty, equal rights to dispose of what they own. Yet the effect of these realities is the illusion that capitalist and worker are equal in power when they really are not. This is an objective illusion, just like seeing the sun rising over the horizon. In that illusion, we naturally take the earth as the baseline against which we see the movement of heavenly bodies like the sun. And now we can say that equal economic liberty, equal legal freedom, from overt force between buyers and sellers functions as a kind of baseline against which we see the relative power of economic agents. We measure them by their equal legal rights, not their real and vastly unequal material wealth. All the basic capitalist transactions are exercises of economic liberty. They begin with an act that cannot be openly forced, say the voluntary signing of a wage contract exchanging labor power for money, and they end with a similar act. Okay? Say the voluntary dissolution of the wage contract. I quit. Okay? Each of these beginnings and endings is characterized by the absence of either party having the power to command the other's obedience and use violence to get it. Each party knows that he can enter or withdraw from any capitalist social interaction without being subject to overt force by the other. What constraint either feels is just a matter of what he happens to own, which naturally appears as a feature of his own good or bad fortune, rather than a condition coercively imposed by the other. Consequently, all capitalist worker interactions, not just the sale of labor, appear as the product of voluntary undertakings between equal people who just happen to own different things. That the worker must obey the commands of his boss is then, in the worker's experience, a condition he freely chose to accept with his voluntary agreement to sell his labor. That he had to make this agreement because it was the only way for him to put food on his table seems only to reflect his misfortune at not being richer, not something forced upon him by the capitalist economic system. Let me pause for a second. That's what does the forcing, by the way. It's not the capitalist. Okay? The capitalist plays his role, but it's the system that structures the society as a division, based on the division, the class division between owners of means of production facing non-owners. If you just had owners of means of production and no workers, well, you wouldn't have capitalism, right? It's because you have those two classes that you have capitalism. Thus, he takes his uncoerced agreement as the baseline by reference to which he comprehends the course of his service to the capitalist, and this arises quite as naturally as taking the visible horizon as that by which we understand the course of the sun. In both cases, the illusion is one that cannot be corrected by better use of one's eyes. Only a theory can correct an objective illusion. In the case of the motion of the sun, that theory is Copernicus's heliocentric theory of the planets. In the case of economic transactions between capitalists and workers, that theory is Marxism. I conclude by just summing this up, okay? For Marx, capitalist labor is forced and some of it is unpaid. This force is accomplished by means of the exercise of economic liberty. And it is hidden ideologically by the fact that economic liberty makes it look like workers' agreement to work for capitalists are truly free. What's more, because these agreements appear free, they appear fair as well. It looks like the worker is getting something roughly equal to what he gives, since otherwise he would not freely agree. This appearance is carried forth by the money illusion. If we take the core meaning of slavery to be a system in which workers are forced to work without compensation, then for Marx, economic liberty facilitates and hides the enslavement of workers in capitalism. It is both the vehicle and the camouflage of capitalist slavery. Thanks for listening. Okay. No, I think I might have to do this thing. So then I don't need this?
You don't even need that.
Okay. All right.
I think I have a microphone. So
I'll do this, okay. Mine on? Mine's on.
I'm still no, there. Not entirely silent. Jeff, thank you very much. That was marvelously put together and a lot of fun to listen to. So I appreciate it and look to, hopefully we'll be able to explore a variety of elements in the time we have for some questions. You mentioned John Stuart Mill. You mentioned John Stuart Mill, who is the other great thinker of the latter half of the 19th century in London. They actually lived apparently close to each other, but Mill never learned of Marx. Marx's notes, by the way, are filled with references to Mill, so certainly one side knew of the other. My first question combines a couple questions I was thinking about with regards to Marx and Mill, and ultimately leads us to America. And that is the Millian response of economic freedom, and that you kind of identify that notion that within the sphere of my action, I should be free to make my own decisions without interference from others, that sort of fundamental economic liberty. I mean, for Mill, it would be just human liberty, not economic liberty is just one expression of it, is clear. But Mill had another sense to that as well, and that was that, if you will, there was a moral component to my action within that sphere that I have control over, that I am, for Mill, it was that inside that space I am making myself into the human being I want to be. I am expressing the individualism that I have. I am creating myself and what I want to have happen out of the resources at my disposal, meager though they could be. And so you could understand the attraction that Mill had on the American public in the latter half of the 19th century as the nation expanded, moved westward, offered opportunity to anybody who could escape the confines of the past and build their world anew. But much of your argument today, and I would suggest much of your argument in some of your books, suggests that the American dream is a false reality for many. So one of the questions is, are we supposed to abandon this individualistic basis, the sort of the Millian side of the American dream? And what do we offer to people in its place?
I'm not for abandoning, I'm certainly not for abandoning Mill. I don't think that, I'm not for abandoning individualism, and I think if you read Marx, you'll see that he thinks that what capitalism basically does is cripple the worker and deprive him of the power to make himself the individual he wants to be. What we accept in return is this consumer crap, so that every year there's some new model and you think, wow, I'm really getting what I want, but it's just the same thing you had last year, or worse, just something that makes you crazy or tired or depressed or something like that. So let me back up here. Let's talk about Mill. I think that Mill does not include economic liberty under his liberty principle. Okay? You're right. Economic liberty is part of the economy, and therefore it can be regulated like the economy can be regulated. Okay? Now, it is true that some of the decisions that you make exercising your economic liberty are ways of making yourself. Okay, so if I decide to spend my money on, travel, am I not holding? See, that's why I thought this thing would be better, because I can't think and chew gum at the same time. The fact is, yes, I am making a choice that's, a choice that reflects me within the options that are available, right? Those are set by the society. Those are set by the things that are available to me in the system, the jobs that are available and the products that are available, okay? And in economic liberty, with economic liberty, what you get is a system that reproduces this capitalist system. Now, look, Marx did not see the productivity of capitalism, okay? I mean, I shouldn't say that. He saw the productivity. You can see it in the Communist Manifesto. He didn't see what it could amount to. He didn't see when it shifted from, building factories and machines to producing consumer goods and so on. Okay, so, some of Marx's feelings about capitalism, I think, are shaped by the capitalism that he saw, and that if he were to see capitalism today, he might have a somewhat more charitable view to it, and if he saw socialism today, or what we've had as socialism today, he might shift quite a lot without changing the fundamental theory. This is what I was hinting at the beginning when I said you can separate Marx's theory of capitalism from his commitment or hopes about socialism and communism. So I don't think that you will find Marx. Marx is not Stalin. He's not Lenin. He's not somebody who wants a regimented society. He's not somebody who thinks that the factory should be organized like armies. He wants to get out of the factories. He pictures a world in which, he says somewhere, in the morning you do poetry, and in the afternoon you do some other kind of thing. His idea of labor is that it should flow from us like the artist's labor flows from him, as an expression of his love, not an expression of just choosing between the consumer crap that happens to be on the shelf today. So I don't think that this is individualism versus some kind of socialized or collectivized thing. I mean, Marx saw that liberty has social conditions, and this itself is a breakthrough after all, because if you think about Locke, who after all is the theoretical founder of the American system. I mean, the Declaration of Independence was largely plagiarized from Marx. I mean, it would be illegal today to steal those words. He just thinks everybody, you're free. That's a natural condition. Okay? Society threatens you with limitation, but your natural condition is free. Well, Marx is more savvy. He realizes that freedom itself has social conditions. So the organization of society is fundamental to your freedom. But the freedom is freedom, and it's individual freedom. Okay? It's individual freedom. Okay? So I don't think that this is individual versus collective in that sense. How's that for a start?
That's a good start. I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it over to you. So you and I are sitting in front of an audience of quite a number of students and the like, and I'm wondering, so if I was to take this version of Marxist theory that you've provided for us, which is quite profound, what kind of problems would you think it's most relevant to, or that most need addressing in the world that we're looking at right now? Like where does this shed the most light that people are missing?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with an easy answer to that. If you listen to modern, what are called neoclassical economists and so on, talking about capitalism, they see it as a sort of mathematical system that's just always on the verge of equilibrium and so on. And then they, are surprised pretty regularly when it, bangs its head against the wall and falls into a crisis. Marx thinks of capitalism as a conflictual system, right? For Marx, the tendency of capitalism is to crisis, right? The amazing thing is that capitalism has been better able than Marx thought it would be to get itself out of the crises. But the crises are natural. The crises are not some external factor that happens to capitalism. Okay? And the labor theory of value is one way of seeing that there's a fundamental conflict between the worker and the capitalist, which means that there's a contradiction in the production of profit itself. Okay? And if you add to that technology, what does technology do? Technology is appealing because it reduces the role of labor. But if Marx is right, labor is the source of profit. So what you get is, and Marx develops this, a theory of the declining rate of profit. And that's part of his analysis of capitalism's crises. Technology itself and the push, the incentive for technology, pushes towards there being a smaller and smaller piece of labor in anything you buy. Okay? And that means that the profit, according to Marx's theory, goes down too. Okay? Goes down relatively. Now, the economy might be much larger, and so therefore, it still might be growing in absolute terms, but as a fraction, it gets smaller, and that's why Marx thought that crises were natural to capitalism. So that's one thing that I think is just very clearly in all of our interest. I also think that Marx has a very interesting model of what labor should be. He really thinks of it as something that ultimately should not be constrained by nature, by needs. He looks forward to a day, if you read his descriptions of what communism or social, he doesn't use the term socialism, by the way. He thinks of a lower and higher stage of communism. Okay? But I mean, as I said to you before, communism was a fantasy. I mean, he got to communism by saying, well, I don't want ownership, private ownership, so we'll have collective ownership. What else is there? Well, so you have this first by the state, then directly by the people. But then he imagines that there would be like workers' groups. They would talk democratically. They would discuss production. They would figure out among themselves what they were going to do, and they would do it without, not in a competitive way. They would do it as an expressive way, as a kind of artistic way. And let me say this too. If you study the history of Western political thought, you will see that nobody speaks positively about democracy until the 19th century, and one of the first is Marx. Okay? This is a very interesting thing and worth your thinking about. The closest you get in philosophy before this, Spinoza, for example, sees that the ideal form of government would be democracy. Each person extending his rule of himself to the joint rule over the society. But he has no belief that human beings are capable of it. Right? He does not believe that, everybody believed, I mean, I've been believing it lately myself, that what democracy does is bring out these ugly passions in people. I mean, that's why people were afraid of it. I mean, you read Aristotle, even Locke. I mean, Locke's theory implies democracy in a way because everybody has an equal right to control their life. But Locke doesn't believe that we should have a democratic system because he doesn't think we're capable of running it. He thinks the passions will come out, and what we need is more of a kind of filtering system so that these better decisions can be made. Okay? So, I mean, Marx's ideal, I think, is interesting, and we should pay some attention to it, and we should think about the way in which he talks about labor, what labor might be. Your labor should be the way you feel about your hobby, the sort of thing that you don't think, well, oh God, when am I going to be done with this? When is the bell going to ring? You think it's the kind of thing that you're doing it, and you think, oh my God, I forgot to eat lunch. Right? Imagine if your labor were like that. The stuff you do for a living. That's what Marx is talking about.
We're going to open the floor for questions. Mason's going to have the microphone here. If you raise your hand, I'll also try to keep attendant to people with their hands raised, and we'll try to get a number of questions from around the room. So.
Hello, my name is Andres. I'm a foreigner, so I think sometimes when people ask me what I like about this country, I say I like that it's actually a very good socialist country in many ways.
A good socialist country.
Yeah. So
well, don't tell everybody, but okay.
No, it's not good. People don't look at you in a good way. But I do think so. I think there have been not only the infrastructure, everything that has been built collectively that everybody can take advantage of that we don't have in other countries, but also some approaches like sending people to the West just to conquer, and by doing that they are giving them the means of production that Marx talks about. So my question is, to what extent you think this country is actually a socialist country, and in what perspectives?
Well, I wouldn't call it a socialist country because, okay, but I think you're right. I mean, look, the West was settled by farmers, okay? Farmers own their own means of production. Small farmers, the family farm is not a capitalist system, okay? Because the farmer and his family own their means of production, okay? And so they can withstand the decline in the market, right? You can always make your own food and so on. Okay, so there is something to that. It's formed by people who just go out there and they get a piece of land. Well, a piece of land is means of production, okay? It's when they get hired into factories, okay? When they lose their farms because of the depression, because of banks, because of modernization that requires you to have more and more land and therefore gigantic machines and all of that, that they leave and they go and work in industry and they lose their ownership of the means of production, okay? So if we're talking about ownership of means of production, yes, I think America does start that way. I think it's settled that way. And then it grows into something that well, I mean, it doesn't seem to last. You know, you get these giant factories and so on, okay? And one final thing. Hamilton, of all of the framers, had a sense of this, had a sense of where it was headed. Jefferson was a kind of idealist. He thought the little farmers would run America forever. Sorry, Jefferson. It doesn't work that way. Okay? Hamilton had some sense, but, you know, he was a very tough-minded guy.
Back in the back.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for a good talk.
You're welcome.
You know, Marx, you said money has value, profit. Where does it come from? Marx tries to explain. Economic liberty, law slants our view of reality, individual freedom. But the one word, because you were talking about ideology, the one word you didn't say is risk.
Risk, yeah.
So where does risk fit into the picture?
Well, I mean, I assume by risk, I mean, the risk that you're talking about, I assume, is the risk the capitalist takes with his property and going in the market, okay? And, well, okay, so that's a kind of risk. If you had a social society, then the society would take the risk. They would make their decisions on on production by some kind of social process, and they would have to face the risk. The capitalist takes that risk, and of course many capitalists go bankrupt and so on. And, you know, so let's say risk is part of the economy. Certainly a growing, innovative economy is going to have risk, because some, you know, a lot of business ventures aren't going to work, a lot of inventions don't work, and so on. Okay, so that's certainly part of it. But there's lots of different ways of doing it, and after all, the capitalist only has a risk because he already owns means of production. Okay, so it's a risk that it's good to be able to have in our society. Okay, it's not some bad thing. It's not as if, you know, he's really doing us a favor by taking that risk. There's nothing else he can do with means of production but risk them in some way. Okay, that's the only way you can make a profit on them. Okay, so yeah, there'll be risk. I think that's right. I think that's right. And let me say one other thing about Marx. You know, Marx was surprisingly sympathetic to the first generation capitalist, okay? A capitalist who started as a worker, put stuff together, and got himself to the point where he owned means of production, gets a pretty positive read from Marx. It's after that, okay? It's when he then passes that on to his child who doesn't have to work for it at all. All he has to do is have the coupons in his hands, and he has the power to command somebody else's labor. Okay? That's interesting. That's, you know, that's the point at which the inequality comes. If you had a society where what you did was let people make as much as they want, but then have 100% inheritance tax, Okay? So each generation has to start off. I don't think Marx would be against that society. Okay? You know, I can't read his mind, but really, I think that would be a whole different story. Okay? It's when you have the successive generations, when you no longer need to do the work, then what's happening is, you know, you're a rich person like that, the whole rest of society is working for you. You don't have to give anything back. Okay? You might. A lot of rich people work, or they do charity work, or whatever it is, okay? But they don't have to. That's key.
We have a question.
You talked about how like Marx's theory of like communism and stuff is kind of like just a fantasy dream and whatever. And I kind of agree with that, but I think it will be possible when egalitarianism in society is like fully fulfilled in all aspects and stuff. And I think we are moving more and more closer to that and stuff. And in addition to that, like we're moving closer to socializing more things worldwide. Like most countries in the world already do have universal health care or some sort of free health care. United States, and I don't know the numbers for a couple of years ago, but I doubt the support for universal health care would be as high as it is now, which is at 71%. Same with stuff for education, which is overwhelmingly more positive than negative views of that in the United States for that being free. So with the increase of egalitarianism and stuff like women's rights, the rights of LGBT people and stuff like that, and the rise of more socialist ideas like free healthcare and stuff like that, do you think his fantasy is possibly going to become a reality in, let's say, I don't know, like hundreds of years from now? Do you think it's possible to happen?
I want to just say, I don't want to take, you know, by a fantasy here, I mean to say he was basically making this up. I mean, there was not a communist thing that he could point to. Okay, that's all I mean. But I think you're quite right. I think some people say, well, Marx predicted that all these capitalist countries would become socialist, but they didn't. Okay? But you're quite right, they became more socialized. Government plays a larger role in the economy now than it did in Marx's time. Okay? And that's to say, social decisions running through the political system are governing or shaping in many ways the economy, and healthcare is a perfect example of it. But, you know, even the sort of Keynesian things that we have, the mechanisms we have to try to moderate the business cycle, to try to soften or quicken depressions and recessions and so on, all of that is a socialized, if not socialist. So there's no doubt in my mind that the tendency is socializing, if not socialistic. Now, you know, what comes out, I tell you, the one thing I think you really know about the future is that it will surprise you. Okay? I'm serious about that. So I hesitate to say, I think we will continue to get more socialized, okay? But the kind of society we're going to have one day, particularly when, as Marx thought, technology reaches the point where it can produce basically everything that people need and a lot of what they want with almost no labor, certainly no unpleasant labor at all. Well, I mean, that world's going to be a world with computers, with internet. I mean, it's already a surprise. I mean, it surprises me every day to think of what it might be in 100 years. As much time now as, say, from the time, you know, say of the Bolshevik Revolution, that I didn't know we were celebrating that birthday. I'm not really particularly celebrating it myself, but, you know, it's part of an important part of history. It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say. But the socializing is a direction that certainly is happening.
We have a question.
Hi, I just wanted to know,
Hi.
what would you define to be the means of production in a modern service-based economy like the United States?
I'm sorry?
What would you define to be the means of production in a service-based economy like the United States?
Well, I mean, what's a service-based economy? I mean, services are things like, say, nurses. So means of production are going to be hospitals, emergency rooms, hospital beds, you know, x-ray machines. You know what these machines that are in your doctor's office cost? You know, that's a fortune. That's a kind of means of production. Obviously, the computer system itself is a gigantic means of production. And part of it's going to be a surprise, you know. You know, maybe these little phones that I see everybody doing, you know, it's just, that's going to be the means of production. I don't know, maybe not.
Could you explain what went wrong in Venezuela, which was a very wealthy country, and now the people are living in utter poverty?
I cannot explain that. I haven't paid close enough attention, and I'm not really an economist. You know, I'm a philosopher. My wife is an economist, and I have cheated a lot. You know, I've stolen a lot of what she has learned. And I try to understand it, but I understand it, you know, from a higher altitude, from a philosophical altitude, not into the particular facts of a particular economy like that. I don't know, you know, I mean, the ruler there seemed to be a bit of a maniac, so I don't know what he might have done.
While we're waiting for the next question to be asked, I wanted to follow up on this line that you've been pursuing. It sounded as if, in the response to the last several questions, that one of the things you might say, so tell me if I'm right, is that one of the concerns Marx has about the modern world, whether it comes in a socialist Venezuelan sense, a socializing American in Europe, and et cetera, is centralization. And that your concern, your argument that Marx's concern was also often a kind of bottom-up sort of worker collectives, so workers becoming just part of a machine, whether that machine is run by the state or run by a capitalist, seems to be a problem maybe for Marx?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think his system would probably have to be decentralized. I think, you know, I mean, remember the original idea of a Soviet. I mean, now it's sort of a dirty word. You don't even like to say it. I mean, I don't like to say it either. But, you know, a Soviet means council, okay? And what do you know, and that comes from Marx. You know, he imagined that there'd be councils. You know, people in industry or in an area would get together and make decisions democratically. Well, that's got to have a lot of decentralization. And I guess for a certain period, people might have thought that decentralization is going to be impossible. Decentralization is the name of the game. It's the way, you know, you get more and more, you have more and more power, so it gets exercised from a single center out and so on, so you get a kind of centralization. But that's one of the things that I think technology makes unpredictable. I think one of the things that, you know, we're seeing with these little phones and so on is we might be capable of a much more decentralized society where decisions could be made much more locally. Okay? And, you know, that's just one of those things that I think is going to surprise us. Yeah, but I mean, I think you're right that centralization is part of the problem. Centralization means more and more people under a single rule. Okay? Well, that doesn't sound so good for freedom, right? So, you know, councils, particularly if you don't have to call them Soviets, you know, that sounds better. Let's have local groups. Let them decide what the productivity will be, like how we will reward people and so on. And, you know, we can't realistically expect to do that until the basic problem of scarcity is solved, right? When Marx talks about the future, he says, when the springs of productive cooperation run freely and technology, blah, blah, it's beautiful, you know. It's like all the scarcity is done. The problem of scarcity, which is, you know, the first thing they teach you about in Economics 101, you know, that when that is over, when technology beats that, when it's no longer necessary to do unwanted labor, okay, well, then we can really start to think about other ways of organizing the society that, you know, are hard to even imagine at this point.
Yeah, my question relates to your discussion of the role of violence between labor and ownership. In 2005, I was working for a cabinet manufacturer, maybe a payroll of 300 people. Housing market tanked. Okay, so there was no need for a lot of cabinets anymore. When the layoff came, there was like 15 cop cars. No joke. It was like 15 cop cars there when they announced the layoff because they thought the workers, some of them had been there for 15, 20 years. They were making a decent wage. Ownership thought there might be violence. So I'm getting to the question, throughout American history, if I heard you correctly, you were saying that the use of violence between workers and owners wasn't that great by the state.
No, I don't think you understood what I was saying. I probably didn't say it clearly enough. What I was saying is that violence as a normal part of the work relationship, the master and the slave, the lord and the serf. The lord was also judge in his fiefdom. So he exercised criminal justice and management of the labor. The master clearly exercised criminal justice and management of labor. He used violence on the body of the slave as part of the relationship between master and slave. What I'm saying is that is no longer part of the work relationship between capitalist and worker. The cop cars that you're talking about were there to protect the capitalist property, okay? Because when those workers get really pissed off, one of the things they sometimes do is smash the machines or break the windows. That's a violation of the right of property, and the state will come in and use force to protect that property. That's the point I was making. That the use of force, by force here I don't mean the means of production type force that I was outlining, I mean overt violence. It recedes. The state uses it to protect the property rights of capitalist and worker. It does not enforce the labor itself with the use of violence. And that's a difference between capitalism and all of the forms of economic production that preceded it.
Would you please join me in thanking Jeff for
One
his
second.
time?
I think you should let this girl, because she's really been trying. I
Oh,
would
you
like to
had a
hear her question.
Oh. Can we get her question? At the request of the speaker to continue speaking.
Thank you. I was wondering whether you think the gig economy, like Uber, is a natural continuation of capitalism, or if it was like trying to escape capitalism.
Well, how does it escape capitalism? I mean, you still have people working. They have to have means of production, in this case, a car. Now, I guess those people, they may own their own car, but you could have Uber services. I believe they do have Uber services where the cars are provided, so that would be a capitalist system. But I think it is one of those things that the new technology here, basically computer and GPS, that's a very important piece of it. And of course, miniaturization, all of that stuff has made a lot of new things possible. And Uber is one of those kinds of things. Okay? And it's another surprise. I mean, nobody thought that was going to, 20 years ago, nobody thought about that. So it's one of those things that'll surprise us. It is a different way of working. It gives people a certain kind of control over their work situation. But I don't think it's not capitalist. I think it's just maybe an advanced form. Okay. Now I won't interfere.
Yeah. So now please join me in thanking Jeff for his time and for his talk.
Well, thanks for listening.